All right, moving into the sub-Sahara Africa, we'll talk about North Africa whenever we talk about the Middle East, so a little bit separately. So, of course, talking about the physical features, looking at the environmental challenges, and especially about weather patterns and circulation that'll kind of flow into a couple other regions, looking at the colonialization, and its impact on political stability and economic opportunity in this area. So the sub-Sahara, again, our book divides the sub-Sahara, so kind of everything below the Sahara Desert is what we're focusing on here in this region. And then it separates North Africa in with not quite up into Europe, Southwest Asia into different regions. So what we are looking at here, whenever we see, get rid of all that, whenever we see all of Africa, again, we're not focusing on the entire part, but mainly everything below the Sahara Desert. So multiple countries, lots of diversity here, but a lot of smaller countries rather than larger ones. But areas like Ethiopia, Kenya are kind of more common ones, the Sudan and Chad, Nigeria. So again, lots of smaller countries that make up this region. Now the geological history, again, of course, Pangea here, and then as we move, of course, ultimately Africa in this region kind of separates here, originally though being more in the middle, and still is, of our world. So again, once part of Pangea, the formation here created the Appalachian Mountains. So actually, we'll see whenever we talk about North Africa, actually, some of the mountain ranges in Africa were actually part of the Appalachian Mountains. So this continent has been drifting apart for the last 225 million years. Now the tectonic action now, so again, of course, the border is where we focus on. So Africa is kind of over, like North America is kind of over top of a plate, so not close to many borders except on the east side there by the Red Sea and kind of down along the eastern coast of Africa. So we have this East Africa rift, so likely development of a divergent plate activity that occurred. Again, our triangles over there show the volcanic activity that occurs along this rift. So again, the dashes, though, are showing that rifting from the diverging plates that are kind of separating it to form. Again, this is very, very slow. All of this happens, not something we'll see a whole lot in our lifetime, but it's over many, many thousands of years that these effects take place. But ultimately, this rifting could lead to the formation of a new ocean many years into the future. And this is showing that Rift Valley. So this is kind of where we're at the moment. Let me clear out some of these. So this Rift Valley that's forming, ultimately leading to the Red Sea, as it continues to mature and continues, this is where that ocean and the Atlantic Ocean is likely to fill in and increase that sea to actually ocean. Now, what are the effects of that rifting that's happening? So it's leading to more lakes. So again, as it continues to move apart and water fills that in. So the water fills in the depressions that are created. And some of these are among the largest and the deepest lakes in the world. All right, so as far as rivers, we have a couple pretty big rivers in this region. So the Nile, one of the longest, provides, lots of water here to North Africa. So we'll come back and talk about it when we get to the North Africa region. But the Congo is actually the second longest river in Africa. So it's the second largest in the world by volume, and it's actually the deepest river in the world. So again, both of these playing major parts to providing water to this region. So our Congo here, and instead of going more north and south, it actually is kind of more of an east and west river that goes through this region. Now there are a couple desert regions. So the Sahara Desert, of course, again, we're talking more everything below that, but that's about a third of North Africa. But then we also have some other deserts more in the southern part. So the Kalahari, the Namib deserts actually cover large parts of the southern part of Africa. Now the climate in here, as far as precipitation, so most of central Africa has a good bit of water close to the equator, so we'll talk a little bit more about why that is. And then it decreases as we move to the north and, of course, to the Sahara Desert, and then as also south, more in those southern deserts that we just had seen. As far as temperatures, it's hottest just at and then a little bit north of the equator, and then the decreases, of course, as we move away north and south. So our temperatures showing here, but again, hottest is going to be right in the middle, so kind of the opposite of the rainfall. So right in the middle, close to the equator, just a little farther north is where the hottest, and then we start cooling down as we move away from that equator. Now, what kind of leads to all of this? I'm going to talk a little bit about weather patterns and global circulation that leads to these deserts. So if we kind of look at the deserts here, you can see across here, so the Sahara, but we also have desert regions, even looking in North America as well. So above the equator and then also below the equator. So we have this specific region, let me just get a different color, right here at the equator, so it's 0, where there's actually a lot of rainfall. So we get a lot of rainfall here around the equator, and then that decreases as we move north and south. Now, the reason for that is that it has to do with kind of the Earth's rotation and some air pressures. So air, people, and whatever rotate faster at the equator and slower as you move away. All right, so right at the equator, that's when everything is moving the fastest. And then as we move away from it, either up or down, everything starts slowing down. So why is that significant? So these things moving in a straight line from the north or south don't actually travel in a straight line. You have to remember that the Earth is round. So if we start at the equator and we'll kick this soccer ball, let's wait for it to come back here. So if we're kicking the soccer ball, instead of it going in a straight line, it actually goes off to the side. And again, that's because the Earth is round. So as we move away from the equator, things start slowing down. So we're going to offshoot that goalpost. So what will happen then if we kick that? Again, so if we start here at the center at the equator, just like the animation just showed, if we kick that soccer ball in a hypothetical straight line, again, as the video just showed, we're going to miss it because, again, we're moving faster here than we are away from the equator. So it's going to go off to the side because it's traveling faster, and it won't go into the goal. So again, kind of shows us again what's happening. So as we move away from the equator, we start slowing down. So our things are not necessarily moving in a direct straight line. All right, so what does that all have to do with anything? So first of all, there's a nice little video here that kind of explains this as well. But essentially what is going to happen with the weather patterns and that causes all these deserts to be formed away from the equator is that here at the equator in what's called the intertropical convergence zone, we get a lot of rainfall. So what's happening is we're getting these low pressures that form. So if you've seen weather maps, you hear about low pressures and high pressures. So low pressures are what are going to create rainfall. That's what we have here at the equator. We have lots of low pressures coming up because it's so hot. So that's going to cause the rain to come down. It precipitates, comes down. So we get lots of rainfall here in this, where we have this low pressure system, lots of rainfall. Now, as we move away to about 30 degrees north or south, as we move away from the equator, now we get into a high pressure. Now the atmosphere starts to cool, and what happens is it leads to these high pressure systems. They get about 30 degrees north and south, and what that does is it creates dry environments. So that's why the Sahara Desert, which is right here in that region, is so dry. And then again, here in the southern part of Africa is so dry because, again, the low pressures at the equator where it's hotter bring about rainfall. the high pressures that occur farther away are causing those dry environments to occur. So again, nice little video here that kind of goes through that, shows it a little more animated, so it's a little easier to visualize. All right, so again, that explains why we have these deserts about the 30-degree where those high pressures start flowing in, and then whether it's north or south, we get into those drier environments due to those high pressure systems. And now some of the environmental changes that are occurring here. So a couple articles here. So severe biodiversity is impact the link of the land use. So a lot of deforestation is occurring in Africa. Again, trying to increase production. So again, lots of habitat loss. So trying to increase agricultural expansion. So chopping down trees, trying to create grazing ground and cropland to provide more food for the growing population in this region. However, that is having huge environmental impacts if we think about, again, climate change and decreasing the trees and the rainforests that then impact biodiversity, but also increase that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Further increases the temperatures and causes more severe weather. So the changes just kind of predicted. This area is, especially right below the Sahara Desert, is going to be significantly impacted by continued rises in temperature. So as the atmosphere continues to increase in temperature, this area here at the equator is going to significantly be impacted. It is going to be essentially too hot. And we move over, we'll see it in India as well when we get to that region. But because of those temperatures, it's essentially going to be uninhabitable. It's just going to be too hot for individuals by about 2050 to even survive in those areas, which is going to displace them and put them into other areas that, again, are already economically stretched and don't have enough resources. So again, looking here at this biodiversity, so that change in habitat as those forests are being destroyed due to land use, again, increasing forest use for crops. So again, those expected to have the smallest change up here kind of in Russia, down even a little bit into Australia. But those with the largest impacts across the board, whether it's amphibians, birds, or mammals, definitely we see Africa hit really hard by all of these. So this increased in habitat loss is decreasing our biodiversity that is heavily going to impact this region. So why do we care? So this biodiversity, again, just the variety of life on Earth, but it is responsible for all of our ecosystem services. So lots of different animals and organisms, plants, animals, all help us to have clean water. They're pollinators for the foods we consume. So if one organism goes extinct, it has this domino effect. And then sometimes we don't even know the effect of removing it until it's too late and it's already gone. Oxygen we breathe, so think about those plants that provide photosynthesis and oxygen. Different medicines are derived from plants that are being destroyed. So again, all of these different organisms play unique roles in keeping everything moving as it is. So the greater biodiversity, the more consistent an ecosystem, the more stable that it can be. So a video here that talks about this farming and the yield gaps. So not only are they destroying lots of farms and lots of forest in order to plant crops, but if we look at the crop yield, which is just the amount of crops harvested from an area, this region has the lowest crop yield in the world. So the land they are using is only producing about 24% of its potential. So they're not very efficient at growing, and again, not enough water, not enough resources to grow effective, healthy plants that can maximize the use of the land. So again, destroying forests to plant crops, but those crops are not being produced efficiently. So some of these reasons for that is the poor conditions of the soil. So even though they're trying to plant them, they're just not growing well. They're not meant for those crops. Again, poor infrastructure as far as government and providing resources. The high cost of getting the seeds and the plants and irrigation. So again, ways to increase that crop yield. So increasing access to finances for individuals who are trying to grow the crops, improving that water supply to them, and then balancing that fertilization. So fertilizing the soil and improving that soil quality. Right. So again, this land degradation, nice little video here about it, but it's looking here at how the crop yield affect the land use. So again, if we look at South Asia has achieved this increase in food production through higher yield. So they have been able to maximize the use of their land. Whereas if we see the sub-Sahara, again, it is the way that they are increasing crops is expanding their land instead of more efficiently growing the crops in the land that they already have. So how can we use technology to help increase that crop production? So a couple papers here, a couple productions. So in Kenya, this DigiCow is actually being produced where it provides free access of livestock management experts and improves the health and livestock or livelihood of the livestock, provides more food for the population. So if we have healthier animals, they produce better yields. Then Thrive Argic in Nigeria. This helps farmers to get products to market so they can buy them. So this provides food for the public at a more affordable cost. And then a couple others, so food production goals versus that climate change goals. So again, destroying land to plant more has impacts on the climate. So the U.S. Global Fertilizer Challenge spurred the investment in food security while lowering carbon emissions. So the European Commission opposed a plan that would support fertilizer production because that accounts for about 5% of greenhouse emissions. So how does fertilizer use compare to the rest of the world? So Africa actually doesn't contribute a lot to the gas emissions. So using fertilizer to them gives them better crop yield and maybe doesn't significantly impact the climate like it is in other parts of the world. So other countries like China, though, have their farmers trained in fertilizer management, so the gas emissions are as low as possible. So kind of balancing those two. So why does Africa use so little fertilizer? Well, because it costs a lot. They don't have a lot of supply. And again, that infrastructure as far as producing it. So it's important for these African countries to begin making their own fertilizer. So they buy about 20 to 30% of Russia's that increases the cost, marks it up for them. So many countries, though, in Africa have the necessary natural gas and phosphate to make their own. So some argue that we should not increase fertilizer use because of its effect. But according to an author of one of these papers, why is this not valid? Well, according to this article, Africa contributes so little to the global greenhouse emissions because they don't have a lot of cars, they don't have a lot of airplanes and all of that. So it's unfair to kind of not allow them to use their fertilizer to increase their crop yield because we don't want them to impact the greenhouse gases when they're one of the ones who have the least emissions anyways. So also whenever the farmers are properly trained, there can be nitrogen fertilizer production without as much emissions. So again, connection here. So the nitrogen fertilizer production requires natural gas to make it. So in order to make fertilizer, it requires natural gas. So it ends up releasing carbon dioxide that increases the greenhouse gases and climate change. So the fertilizer increases the crop yield, but gets converted to nitrous oxide, which is another greenhouse gas. All right, so kind of switching away from the environmental impacts, moving more into the kind of the history. So Nigeria, thinking about pre-colonial times. So the Nok civilization, about 1500 BC to 200 AD. It's the earliest known sculptures of smelt iron. So one shown over here. Then about 700 to 1000 AD, the spread of Muslim religion from North America into this region. The Neri Kingdom of Igbo people. This was around 1100 to 1900 AD, so getting a little closer to today. This expanded by different oaths and converts, so converting to, again, culture and religion. So this was not by force. Again, it was unlike most of the other expansions we've seen. So this was by conversion, not by force. All right, unfortunately, we can't talk about this region without talking about slave trade. So this began about 14 to 1500s, mainly in Portugal, the European capture of Nigerians. So why was it this region that slave trade was so prevalent? So first of all, it was a coastal country, so it was easier to access than some of the other countries. The Igbo society that we just talked about had a caste-like system, so they, had different different layers. So people born in poverty stayed in poverty; those born to wealth stayed wealthy. So that was already set up to kind of have a slave-like society, to where some people were less thought of less than or servants to others. So that lower caste were readily sold as slaves. So it was actually an economy, a resource that brought about money for this region. Now, the colonial human economic and political geography. So the Lagos was annexed by Great Britain in 1852. The entire country was colonized by 1884. So kind of the where and the why. So the agricultural resources, so that palm oil, so thinking about trade that was used as an industrial lubricant, was a good resource. So the police of the slave trade, so slavery was abolished in 1807. Trying to prevent that, and then also spreading Christianity in this region. Now, the trade interests largely were overseen by the Royal Niger Company. So Nigeria is a very diverse country. It's one of the more populated countries in this region. So the British colonial rule attempted to keep groups separate to limit conflict. The northern Nigeria was predominantly Muslim, and then southern less Muslim. So Christianity was able to kind of take root more in that area. So more amenable to those missionary schools. And over time, the economy evolved, associated more with Western education, and was more westernized, more industrialized than what the northern part of that region was. Now, after colonialization, they had full independence in 1960. That country borders include large ethnic groups, so very diverse, so lots of conflicts. So the Boko Haram, if you've heard of that, this is one of the deadliest terror groups that operated in northeast Nigeria. So the goal was to spread Sunni Islam and to destroy the Shia Islam. So again, culture and religion motivated, as they were trying to force their views onto others and eliminate others. And as far as their economy, so Nigeria is one of the largest players in their economy, so it's the, again, most populated. The southern part and the coastal regions, again, are more wealthy than the northern parts. So oil was discovered there, so that is one of the main exports from Nigeria. It's provided a huge resource to their economy, but also mining of other natural resources is kind of the second most common resource. So if we look again here, crude petroleum, about 72% of the economy comes from that. Then we have petroleum gas as well. But again, huge part of their economy. And then just kind of finishing up here, unfortunately, due to all of the diversity, comes along with kind of corruption and neo-colonialism. So it's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. So the sub-Saharan countries are very corrupt relative to the rest of the world. The oil and gas production that is part of their economy is state-owned. So they control everything that's happening. So again, a video here that kind of talks about or goes through that as well. So the politicians greatly benefit from the sell and the production of those resources. The tax revenue is reduced here. So there's less taxes to assist the whole country. So essentially the wealthy get wealthier and the poor get poorer. So it's not distributed evenly across the country. So for example, the coastal and southern Nigeria benefits the most because that's where the petroleum is, the northern part the least. And then this idea of neo-colonialism is where there's indirect control of an underdeveloped country by developed one. So again, the influence that say the US or Europe plays on these more underdeveloped countries, to where they kind of come in and they help them, but really trying to gain something out of it. So that's the idea of neo-colonialism. So because Africa is relatively a very poor country, there is a lot of this neo-colonialism trying to, where we have these industrialized countries that are going in and helping, quotes around helping these countries so that they can get their resources, such as, again, the petroleum. And they offer some assistance, but probably having it, in some cases, a more negative impact than helping. All right, and that wraps up this region for today.